From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Georgette Dorn, and I'm the Chief of the Hispanic Division, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this wonderful event, despite the horrible rainy day. It is my pleasure to introduce Catalina Gomez, a reference librarian and specialist in Hispanic literature. Catalina Gomez.
Dr. Charlotte Rogers is Assistant Professor of Spanish at the University of Virginia. Her book, Jungle Fever, Exploring Madness and Medicine in 20th Century Tropical Narratives, was published in 2012. In 2014, she was a Kluge Fellow here at the Library of Congress, where she researched her new book project about the legend of El Dorado in contemporary literature of the Americas. In 2015, Princeton University awarded her the library research grant to study its archive of Mario Vargas Llosa's paper. Please join me in welcoming Charlotte Rogers.
Thank you very much, Catalina, for your warm words of welcome. And thank you, everyone, for coming here today, despite the rain. I'm really honored to be here, particularly in this room, because I hope you have a chance to look around while you're here. There are some Stradivari over there in the corner, and while we were setting up for this event, they were playing them, because I have to kind of give them a good workout every once in a while. So the Library of Congress is a very special place, and I have loved it ever since I was a Kluge Fellow here, and I particularly fell in love with the Hispanic Division and its resources. So, for all of those reasons, it's a very special privilege for me to speak to you today about Álvaro Mutis. As a Colombian poet and novelist, Mutis was often overshadowed by his friend and compatriot Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Scholars often compare them, even though their work is completely different, just because they were from the same place and they ended up living next door to each other in Mexico City in exile. So what I'm going to propose to do here today goes against that tradition of constantly comparing Mutis and Garcia Marquez. I'm actually going to do a sort of literary contrapunteo, or a point and counterpoint, that compares not Mutis and Garcia Marquez, but actually Mutis and Miguel de Cervantes, perhaps a much more surprising comparison. So I've chosen this musical contrapuntal structure for a couple of reasons. First, the juxtaposition between Cervantes and Mutis, who is shown here with a cocktail, which I love. I hope my next book has a read with a cocktail in the author photo. So, in comparing these two great authors, I want to pay homage to Mutis and really put him on the same level with Cervantes, which I think is a bold claim. Second, I am paying a very personal tribute to Edith Grossman, who is the translator of the Adventures and Misadventures of Mackerel, as well as Don Quixote by Cervantes. And so, as Catalina mentioned, you have the chance to buy the Adventures of Mackerel, which is Edith's translation. But the last and most important reason why I want to compare these two authors is that there are many affinities between Mutis and Cervantes, both biographical and literary. This is so much the case that I think that Mutis actually wrote with Cervantes in mind, and I'm going to point out a couple of places here today where I think we can see Mutis thinking about Cervantes. So this contrapunteo is designed to highlight those enduring values and the contemporary relevance of Álvaro Mutis. Also, I really just want to provide points of departure for our question and answer period, because I think that's always the most illuminating part of a talk for me. So, to begin, due to these accidents of birth, I should state the obvious, and these two men clearly belong to different nations and eras, right? Álvaro Mutis was born in Bogotá, in Colombia, in 1923. He took up residence in Mexico City in the late 1950s, where he died on September 22nd, 2013. So this is also really a tribute to him, just a few short years after his passing. So, and of course, I'm sure most of you know Cervantes lived in Spain and died in Madrid in 1616. But despite these differences, the men share biographical elements that mark their literary production. So I'll give you just a few examples. First, both authors showed a really early preference for writing poetry and a penchant for more colorful activities. Cervantes once wounded a man in a duel, and Álvaro spent his free time playing pool, so much so that he actually never graduated from high school. So he spent a lot of time in the billiard hall and reading novels. He said Dickens was one of his favorites. More importantly, the sea also plays a large role in the work of both men and their lives. Cervantes famously lost an arm in the 1571 naval battle of Lepanto, which earned him the epithet El Manco de Lepanto, right, or the one-armed man from Lepanto. Now, in a less military way, water imagery is an essential part of Mutis's prose and poetry. Throughout this talk, I'm going to point out a couple of aquatic motifs, I think, that really mark Mutis. And I think we're going to start doing that by listening to one of Mutis's poems that features water. So you're going to have to bear with me here as I sneak out. We're going to listen to a poem called Nocturno. We'll show it here. So this is a poem called Nocturno from Los Trabajos Perdidos from 1965. And as Catalina mentioned, all of this is available on the website of the Library of Congress. So we're going to just play right off the internet here. And I should mention, I'm going to be reading translations of Mutis's prose work, but I've left his poetry in the original Spanish. So I invite you to close your eyes and listen to Mutis as he reads his own work. This is Nocturno.
También del libro Los Trabajos Perdidos, Nocturno. Esta noche ha vuelto la lluvia sobre los cafetales, sobre las hojas de plátano, sobre las altas ramas de los cámbulos. Ha vuelto a llover esta noche un agua persistente y vastísima que crece las acequias y comienza a henchir los ríos que gimen con su nocturna carga de lodos vegetales. La lluvia sobre el zinc de los tejados canta su presencia y me aleja del sueño hasta dejarme en un crecer de las aguas sin sosiego, en la noche fresquísima que chorrea por entre la bóveda de los cafetos y escurre por el enfermo tronco de los balsos gigantes. Ahora, de repente, en mitad de la noche, ha regresado la lluvia sobre los cafetales y entre el vocerío vegetal de las aguas me llega la intacta materia de otros días, salvada del ajeno trabajo de los años.
Lovely. So I hope that you can hear that cascade of water, falling over the coffee plants in the poem, and that brings a very cleansing, fresquísima lluvia, in the words of Mutis. So water also appears in Mutis's prose, always as a cleansing or liberating image. In fact, Mutis's most famous literary character is also a sailor, right? The peripatetic and melancholic mariner named Mackerel el Gaviero. And I think that there is a great similarity there, actually, between Cervantes and Mutis, in the sense that both men created a literary or a fictional person who outlives them. Right? You all know about Don Quixote. He's become a kind of iconic figure. But I argue that Mutis's character Mackerel should be just as famous. So Mackerel appears in a series of 7 short novels, collected in English, as we mentioned, as The Adventures and Misadventures of Mackerel. And in those novels, the eponymous protagonist travels the world, right, on a variety of unsuccessful quests. So I think you can see some similarities already between Mackerel el Gaviero and Don Quixote. But I think we should go a bit deeper. So let's start looking very closely at his name, Mackerel el Gaviero. Mackerel, Mutis stated in lots of interviews, is actually his own invention. It's a made-up name, though he wanted to give it a vaguely Scottish flavor, which you can hear with the mac in the Mackerel. Yet Mackerel is also intended to be of inscrutable origin. Right? Mutis never reveals his country of birth. He speaks multiple languages, and the reader learns only that he traveled on a fake passport from Cyprus. Right? So it gives you an idea of a shady past in his background. In reality, I would like to argue that his patria is the sea. Right? Now, his nickname, El Gaviero, is also an explicitly nautical reference. The gavia in Spanish means the jib, right? It's one of the sails on a large ship. And the gaviero is the sailor who manages it, often from a very high point up on the mast, right? So it's kind of a lookout point as well. So in her translation, Edie Grossman has very deftly rendered Mackerel's nickname, El Gaviero, as the lookout, a title that refers explicitly to that sailor who perches up on the crow's nest of the ship and scans the horizon for dangers. In fact, this position at the top of the mast was also known formerly as the carajo, if you'll excuse my rather vulgar language here. Okay? So being in the carajo was not very highly desired because of the wind and the rain, and that, and this may be a folk etymology, but as far as I've been able to tell, that nautical post gave rise to the expression vete al carajo, which now has the meaning that all of you are thinking of right now. So when we take these two aspects of the name together, Mackerel, El Gaviero, evokes a traveler with a capacity for self-invention. Right? He's employed in a rather antiquated profession, and he contemplates the vastness of the ocean and the depths of human folly. So, Mackerel and Don Quixote, in this counterpoint that I'm doing, are actually very similar. If we remember that Alonso Quijano also invents himself as Don Quixote. He too takes up an antiquated profession, right, that of knight-errant. And he also travels over the vast landscape of La Mancha. In another sense, I think that both characters are really from nowhere, right, in the sense that Mackerel has no fixed home. Don Quixote is from La Mancha, which is so arid and boring that it's like being from nowhere. But I think great things can come from nowhere. And each character always sets out, right, to perform these great feats. And so that's what makes them similar in their uniqueness. So let's turn back now to our authors. The most significant biographical similarity between Cervantes and Mutis is that both spent a formative period of time in jail. They were imprisoned for what we would call today white-collar crimes, right? Cervantes was involved in disputes in his very odious job as a tax collector, and as a result, he was incarcerated several times. In 1956, Mutis was working in public relations for Standard Oil, which is now known as Exxon. When he was accused of embezzling company funds, he fled to Mexico. And from there, Mutis fought the extradition process back to Colombia, but the Mexican officials detained him for 15 months in what is known as the, there's the books that we're working with here. So he was detained for 15 months in the Black Palace of Lacombe Battery, also known as El Palacio Negro. It's one of the most notorious, it was one of the most notorious prisons in Mexico. And since 1978, it's actually housed the archives in Mexico. So I think there's an amazing coincidence there between writing and the written word and imprisonment, right, which often gives rise to really great works of literature. So the charges against Mutis were later dropped, and they were largely attributed to the political wranglings of the Colombian dictator Gustavo Rojas Pinilla at the time. But nevertheless, Mutis spent 15 months in Lacombe Battery, and I think that had a very powerful effect on his later literature. Okay. So in fact, these harsh experiences turned out to be a boon for both men's literary creations. Cervantes writes in the prologue to part 1 of the Quixote that the idea for his great work came to him in the jail of Seville, right? And any of you who have seen Man of La Mancha, the musical, know that it starts with Cervantes in prison. Right? But Mutis also found inspiration there. He published a few short vignettes about his time in Lacombe Battery, and it's called a Lacombe Battery diary. The best image that Mutis creates in that diary is yet again an aquatic motif, right? He envisions a torrential rain, similar to the one we heard earlier, that will flood the prison, and it fills him with hope. In this instance, water imagery indicates freedom, right? Seas, rivers, rains all symbolize liberty for Mutis. And he hopes that it will carry him out floating onto the vast floodwaters, and it will, and I quote from the diary, leave behind judges, ministers, scribes, guards, and all the other beasts that cling to human flesh and blindly beat their heads against us in a furious attempt to destroy us. So, in the rest of his life's work, Mutis would deplore the injustice and the incompetence of bureaucratic ordeals. Cervantes similarly critiqued the Holy Brotherhood and the suffering of the galley slaves in the Quixote, if we can recall. These bleak prison stints turn out to be what Mutis calls el fértil miseria, okay, o la fértil miseria, fertile misery for both men, because their novels exhibit a very deep sympathy for single individuals and an equally deep skepticism towards the possibility of justice in human society. So, in addition to this formative prison time, both men turned away from poetry and towards prose very late in their life. In fact, their masterpieces came when they were in their late 50s and early 60s. Cervantes was 58 when he published the Quixote. Mutis was in his 60s and retired from publicity work at multinational corporations when he wrote that 7 series of novellas. And I find that very inspiring, right, for all of us to think that we all have a great literary masterpiece inside us that may come out when we're, retired, getting closer towards the last portion of life. So, up to this point, I've talked about the biographical similarities between Cervantes and Mutis. I think the more important question is really, do they share a literary vision? I argue that yes, and we can see their common aesthetic in 2 ways. The first one, and they're related elements, right? The first one is a very keen perception of the folly of human endeavors. The second is a profound sense of disillusionment, or desengaño, as it's known in Spanish. These contrasting sentiments, a dark humor and an ironic, wistful bitterness, are really 2 sides of the same coin. So that underneath the traveling romps of their protagonists lies a harsh and biting critique of the era in which each author lived, and a reflection on the fleeting nature of human existence, both of them having suffered so much. But first, let's start with the fun stuff. So we're going to look at human folly. Okay? Cervantes, and I'm going to ask you to remember or imagine the Quixote, just in case you haven't read it. We don't have that for sale today, but I think you can find a few copies here in the library. So let's look at folly. You can think of a very famous scene in the Quixote in a roadside inn, which features a hunchbacked girl named Meritorious. Okay, she's a servant, and Cervantes says she is del un ojo tuerta y del otro no muy sana, right? So she's blind in one eye, can barely see out of the other. However, Meritorious, in addition to being a servant, is supposed to offer her nocturnal services to a mule driver who is staying in the same room as Don Quixote and Sancho in the inn. So when Meritorious comes into the room, it's dark and she stumbles around and she suddenly ends up in the arms of Don Quixote. Now she's wearing burlap, and she smells of rotten salad, ensalada trasnochada, right? But the knight-errant, in his madness, believes that she's a beautiful princess, and he starts wooing her fervently in the middle of the night. This wakes up the mule driver, who goes into a jealous rage and beats Don Quixote to a pulp. In the meantime, Meritorious is hiding under the bed, and when Sancho discovers her, she beats him up again, right? So there's a lot of very physical comedy in the Quixote, but really, I think Cervantes is pointing out, as would Mutis, the ridiculous ironies of male desire, right? And the ability to suspend your disbelief, right, in pursuit of desire. So let's look at how Mutis does the same thing. Okay. I want to highlight Mutis's, perhaps his most famous novel from the Mackerel series. It's called Ilona llega con la lluvia, okay, or Ilona comes with the rain. It was also made into a movie, which is very famous. And again, I want to point out we can see the importance of water here in the alliterative title of the book, Ilona llega con la lluvia. So the Ilona of the title is Mackerel's companion and lover, whom he happens to re-encounter in Panama after a long time they've spent apart. Ilona convinces Mackerel that they should start a brothel in order to make enough money to leave Panama and to continue on their adventures together. Now, what's special about this brothel, according to Ilona, is that the prostitutes all appear to be foreign airline stewardesses on a layover in Panama. Okay? So I teach this novel to my undergraduates. They're scandalized. But the most important thing is that they don't understand, since they were born in the late 90s, right? They don't understand why stewardesses or azafatas were seen as something exotic or desirable. So for me, the hardest part of teaching this is that I have to explain to them that air travel used to be seen as this pleasant luxury, right? And that having sex workers look like stewardesses actually lent a very cosmopolitan and sophisticated air to what is really a very sordid an ancient commercial enterprise. So Ilona in particular gleefully exploits male gullibility. She spends a lot of time fabricating these uniforms. She concocts exotic backstories for these very average employees. They're all local girls, but they pretend to be from more exotic places. I think everyone enjoys playing a role in some way. I think we see some echoes of Don Quixote here. So that's how Mutis really highlights the folly of male desires. Yet I'd like to talk about one more very serious similarity to Cervantes in this novel. So one of Ilona and Mackerel's employees, named Larissa, has gone completely insane. She has been driven mad by reading. Right? For several years prior to her employment, she constantly read stories about the Napoleonic era. And now, in the novel, she believes that she is visited every night by French and Italian soldiers to whom she makes love. Now, it is clear in the narrative that these soldiers are actually ghosts, right? And that she is tormented, and she eventually, well, I won't spoil the ending for you, but it doesn't end well. So, in essence, she has been driven mad by literature, just like Don Quixote. Right? So Alonso Quijano, before he's Don Quixote, Alonso Quijano reads so much that, and I'm quoting here from Edie's translation, his brains dried up and his fantasy filled with everything he had read in his books. Now, Mutis is clearly thinking of Cervantes here in creating Larissa. The similarities between Don Quixote and Larissa are made even more obvious by the fact that Larissa lives on a houseboat called El Lepanto, right, which recalls that same naval battle where Cervantes lost his arm. Moreover, Mackerel is also a quixotic figure because he, too, stays up all night reading medieval histories of French battles, and he declares that he is, and I quote, living in a time completely alien to my interests and tastes. So for both Mackerel and Don Quixote, literature is more compelling than reality. Okay. Now, I mentioned that both writers exhibit a sense of disenchantment with their current societies, so that's sort of the darker side of things here. For example, in Ilona Arrives with the Rain, Mackerel grows bored of running the brothel when he realizes that, and I quote, prostitution is just as conventional as marriage. This is again where my students kind of explode, and they have a really hard time discussing this, right? But so why are they the same? Mackerel says both are made up of suffocating routines, trivial stories, and calculated meanness. Now, I think that Mackerel has become a beloved Latin American literary figure. I can't tell you how many of my scholarly friends sign their email signatures with a Mutis quote, right, from some Mackerel story. Things just like this. Mine, though, does not say prostitution as conventional as marriage. I think my husband would probably try to translate that, and I don't think he'd appreciate that very much. But this is why we love Mackerel, right? He rejects all of the accepted mores. He hates geographical fixity. He despises bourgeois mentality. So, if we want to live like Mackerel, how can we avoid these suffocating routines? Mutis indicates that Mackerel's refusal to stay in one place and his rejection of material goods frees him, right? Just much like Don Quixote, he's able to travel as he pleases. Mutis's early poetry also shows this same thirst for new experiences. So right now I'm going to read one of his early prose poems called Los Viajes. And I'm going to read it in Spanish to help so you can hear the rhythms, and if you don't speak Spanish, you can think about maybe learning while I read this aloud. No, but really you can listen to the rhythms of Mutis's poetry here. So, dice, faltan aún por descubrir importantes sitios de la tierra, los grandes tubos por donde respira el océano, las playas en donde mueren los ríos que van a ninguna parte, los bosques en donde nace la madera de que está hecha la garganta de los grillos, el sitio en donde van a morir las mariposas oscuras de grandes alas lanudas, con el color acre de la hierba seca del pecado. Buscar e inventar de nuevo. Aún queda tiempo. Bien poco es cierto, pero es menester aprovecharlo. So I think you can hear there some of the same aquatic motifs I was mentioning. But I think we also hear from this poem, which is from 1953, before Mutis went to prison or lived in exile, you can hear its youthful excitement, right? Its wonder at imaginary and natural worlds there. It's also a meta-literary poem, because those of you who have studied French or Hispanic literature know that it sounds a lot like Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, right, the flowers of evil. There's a very famous phrase from one of those poems that says, go out in search of the unknown, right? It doesn't matter if it's hell or heaven, go in search of the unknown. So I hear a strong echo of that 19th century poet here. So in fact, I would say that the inspiration for travel, for adventure, for Mackerel and also for Don Quixote always comes from reading, right? There's a very close relationship between the text and the voyage here. Okay? So I'd like to mention one other way in which Mutis pays homage to Cervantes, and it's a meta-literary homage. In The Snow of the Admiral, or La Nieve del Almirante, which is the first in the Mackerel series, Mutis alludes to Cervantes in the very way in which he structures the narrative. So at the beginning of the novel, we're thinking of La Nieve del Almirante, a frame narrator finds Mackerel's diary, and it's written on scraps of paper. These old scraps of paper have been tucked into a volume of French history, which the narrator finds in an antiquarian bookstore in Barcelona. Okay? So this complicated narrative device is called the found manuscript. And it echoes the way that Cervantes frames the Quixote, very famously, right? In the Quixote, the narrator ends up buying a part of the novel that we read, which has actually been written in Arabic, and we read it in translation, right? And it's been written in Arabic on the backs of old papers, right, in a particular neighborhood in Toledo, in Spain. So again, we can see very clearly that Mutis is making a reference to Cervantes here in a meta-literary beginning. And he does this because Mutis, like Cervantes, wants to say that his tale is as much about literature itself as it is about the idea of travel, right, and adventure. So to wrap up this portion, I want to say that both authors are fascinated by that act of storytelling because it shows off the capacity of literature to transport and transform us, right? It can transform the authors, the protagonists, and the readers all together. So reading is a transformative experience. So let's return now to that sense of disenchantment or desengaño that I mentioned earlier. Both Mackerel and Don Quixote would rather live in literature than in their contemporary reality, and some of us may feel the same way. As a result, when the literary characters are confronted with this yawning chasm between their literary reveries and their quotidian realities, they become nostalgic for an imagined past, right? They're nostalgic not for what they've lived before, but for what they have read about, right? They want to live in a literary world. There's also a sense that both authors think their protagonists' best days are behind them. And I think that may come from the late time in life in which both authors wrote their works. So the second part of the Quixote, which was published in 1615, right, portrays Spain in decadencia, right, the decline of Spain with a wasteful aristocracy and a bureaucracy. And even right before he dies, Don Quixote comes to his senses as Alonso Quijano, and he suffers an extreme form of disenchantment. He repudiates all of his adventures. Okay? So he is disenchanted with the notion of performing great feats. Right? It's a very sad ending. And the reader is also left with that sense of disillusionment with the Spanish Empire, with adventure, with literature, all together. Now, in a similar fashion, in The Snow of the Admiral, La Nieve del Almirante, Mackerel is very skeptical about the values of the contemporary era. He decries, and I quote, "people dedicated to working like mules for that empty thing they call progress." Most disheartening of all, Mackerel is an adventurer in an age without new places to discover. Right? When I think of Google Earth, I realize that there are very few places now that we can't just zoom in on and get a close satellite photo of. So in The Snow of the Admiral, the mariner confesses, and I quote, "a growing discouragement and lack of interest in travel and life itself." And I think this is why John Updike, in one of his excellent book reviews in The New Yorker, wrote that Mackerel was a latter-day Don Quixote. So Mackerel and Don Quixote are both wanderers who ultimately critique the societies that they live in. Indeed, Mackerel's disillusionment is a very contemporary form of Cervantean desengaño, and I think that is the hallmark of Mutis's literary aesthetic. Despite all the ridiculous folly and adventures he has, at heart there is a very deep place of sadness and disenchantment there, right? Ultimately, Don Quixote and Mackerel are thwarted in their attempts to travel. They don't accomplish the great feats of bravery that they set out to do. I think that each author depicts a society, be it 17th century Spain or late 20th century Latin America, in which great adventures are impossible and even ridiculous. Right? Don Quixote is literally loaded onto a cart and driven home at the end of part one. Right? Mackerel, too, repeatedly embarks on adventures that lead to failure. When Mackerel is left penniless and hopeless after one of these adventures, he concludes, and I quote, "I've spent my whole life setting out on this kind of adventure and finding the same disillusionment at the end. Although I console myself with the thought that the reward was in the adventure itself, and there's no reason to search for anything but the satisfaction of trying every one of the world's roads, they all start looking suspiciously alike. And yet they're worth traveling if only to stave off tedium and our own death." So this is one of the enduring values and contemporary relevance of Cervantes and Mutis. They both recognize that travels and readings just serve to distract us from the inevitability of death. In fact, many of Mutis's poems confront the subject of death. And I'm going to conclude here today by analyzing just one of them as a way to remember Mutis's passing in 2013. So we're going to look at 3 lines from a poem called Poema de Lástimas a la muerte de Marcel Proust. So, as the title suggests, the poem laments the death of the French poet, Proust, French novelist, Marcel Proust, who suffered from asthma and died of pneumonia in 1922. This poem was written in the Lacombe Battery prison in 1956, and Mutis is undoubtedly contemplating his own demise as well. Mutis describes Proust's last asthmatic breath here when he says, "Por última vez, tu pecho se alza en un violento esfuerzo por librarse de la losa que te espera." So I am haunted by this image here, and I hope you are too, of the poet attempting to free himself, attempting to breathe, while a gravestone is pressing down on his chest, right? So you have that connection between asthma and the proximity of death symbolized by the grave. Oh, it's very powerful. Mutis further envisions death for Proust as a nostalgic limbo, where his literary creations, which he calls criaturas, or creatures here, are waiting for him. So here he says, and he's thinking of Proust, but I think he's thinking of himself here too. El silencio se hace en tus dominios, mientras te precipitas vertiginosamente hacia el nostálgico limbo, donde habitan a la orilla del tiempo tus criaturas. So we readers, right, are left thinking of Mackerel as the creature awaiting Mutis on the shores of time. Right? Just like Proust created his novelistic creations, we also have Mutis. Right? The richness of Mutis's novelistic and poetic worlds are our consolation as readers, right? When we're devastated by, as Mutis says of Proust, we're devastated by la fértil permanencia de tu sueño, la ruina del tiempo y las costumbres en la frágil material de los años. So Mutis's tribute to Proust, I think, expresses what we as admirers of his work now feel for the Colombian author, right? Death may await us all, but this writer's legacy lives on. So thank you very much. Okay. So now my favorite part, questions. And please do use the microphone if you'd like to ask some questions. I look forward to it.
With your interest in these characters who pursue literary quests that are doomed to failure, that sounds not just like a Mutis or a Cervantes theme, but like a Charlotte theme. Couldn't that be incorporated into your El Dorado books?
Thank you, Tom. Tom was an excellent reference librarian who helped me while I was a Kluge Fellow here, working on a book I have in progress about the legend of El Dorado in contemporary Latin America. And as a matter of fact, Mutis is one of the authors that I study in my book project called Mourning El Dorado, because in The Snow of the Admiral, one of the novels I mentioned, Mackerel travels up a river to in search of a sawmill that he thinks is going to make him a lot of money. But the interesting thing about the sawmill is that it is described using language similar to what the Spanish conquistadors several hundred years earlier used to describe El Dorado. So it has a golden halo, it glimmers and shimmers in the distance, it hums, and it's completely inaccessible. And he's never allowed in, and he's shipped off back downriver without completing his quest, right? So I think that there are echoes there of Cervantes, but also of the notion of the search for a terrestrial paradise, a more general idea of utopia, right, as that no place where perfection exists, kind of in Thomas More's idea. So yes, Mutis, in La Nieve del Almirante, it's just one of those unsuccessful quests where we also see the notion of the quest for El Dorado as a failure. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Professor Rogers. My name is John Elpino. I'm trying to keep my comments up 90 seconds or so.
Okay.
First off, I have to say, as someone who's been to many lectures in college and whatever, so may I say, in full honesty, I thought that was an exquisitely elegant presentation.
Thank you.
In fact, your unique blend of certain phrases was, I've actually without parallel recent essays for most years. I'm going to say that first of all. And also, even though my family's from Colombia, and I've told you I actually first met yesterday, and my first met a lecture 3 days ago, like by happenstance, I happened to grew in the DC area. I actually had never heard about Mr. Mutis until I literally saw the flyer for this 3 days ago, and curiosity is why I came. And I'm very, very glad, not only because to learn so much more about him, and your presentation of it, but also some motifs and themes that you expressed. And it is very poignant nostalgia, I think, some of the elements you described about Cervantes and Mackerel and others. And some of the broader things I found very resonating as far as the elements of sea and others mentioned wandering. And of course, we talked briefly other famous works of art and works of literature. I'm sure, of course, you talk about the Odyssey and other famous works of like On the Road, One Wanders. But I want to ask something hopeful, even though I understand why some of us point of bleak and forebode. I may like to just put a little spin on it. Obviously, those like Philip Roth, who almost like got to disillusioned literature that they stopped. Others who find no more literature is no little refuge and corner. But I would like to add a little brief, quick spin on it that my favorite person in history and writer, is Winston Churchill. And I'm not going to have a political discussion. Rather more the idea of like living beyond oneself, like for love, for example. And I'm not sure you explore this, or whether explicitly or left out or implicitly left out. But the idea of one's soul and taking some quest for adventure all by themselves, and between bleak realize they're all alone. And whether maybe that kind of disillusionment actually is the fact that one is not with them. I mean, a famous poem I'm sure you probably know, somebody not know, Robert Frost's Wing to Wing, Oar to Oar. The idea that Frost wrote this poem in commemoration of his daughter's wedding, to learn how one should travel like two birds in flight, or go wing to wing order, with the idea of your partner was marriage or whatever. And I understand some people frown upon them or whatever. The idea of something beyond yourself. Like even Churchill ultimately, a quick example to try to finish, at an episode late in his life, after the both prime ministerships, the kind of round table, saying if you were kind of parlor game, you're not who you were, who would you most want to be in history? And it was kind of tricky when I see who did he say. Everyone at the table kind of said, oh, Napoleon, yada, 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 great history. And finally got to him, he looked at his wife and said, if I were not who I am, I wish I were the second Mr. Churchill. That's how much his wife meant to him. Like he did it all over again. Even his final last words were, the journey is worth making once. This notion of like, because he loved his wife so much, it was always out of love. Like it wasn't so much like to be famous, but it was like, if I were not who I am, I wish I were the second, And I think it's actually, not to say it doesn't happen, but I think the idea of finding adventure might be more satisfactory to your character imaginary, real life, as someone with your fun or friend or whatever. That's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for your question. I think that you're touching on some important points. Yeah, no, I think you're touching on some important points, especially the universality of the human, the idea of the quest, right, that we see in all different kinds of literature, from the Odyssey up into, Mutis, I would say, is a very postmodern look at the quest. And many critics also read Mutis as an existential hero in many ways. There's one point in Ilona llega con la lluvia, and Ilona comes with the rain, where Ilona looks at Mackerel and says to him in French, les jeux sont faits, right, which is the die is cast, which is also the title of a very famous play by Jean-Paul Sartre. So I have seen some great student papers comparing Mackerel to Sisyphus, right, and the idea of that existential crisis of, even though we know that we're all going to die, how are we going to make our lives meaningful, right, and how are we going to continue in that struggle? And I think that's why Mackerel continues his journeys. And it's knowing that, he has a line about knowing that no matter what happens, you're always going to accept your destiny and make something of it, while you're going. And so I think that for Mackerel, and I think for Mutis in some ways, living well was part of that resistance to death. I was talking with Edith Grossman, his translator, who knew him well, and said that he always had the best food, the best liquor. He would have these long literary evenings in Mexico City with Garcia Marquez. So I think that, especially for someone who has suffered in prison, or has confronted political exile, I think the notion of living well is a form of resisting death. So that's what I would certainly take from Álvaro. So, thank you.
Actually, we have a question.
Yay.
So I'm curious about this relationship that Mutis had with water, and Colombia geographically is such a, there's just so vast amount of rivers and the two oceans. We have the Atlantic and the Pacific. Can you talk a little about like how, where did he live in Colombia, or where did he travel around the country, and if this encounter with so much water there was sort of what gave rise to?
Yeah, I think that we see water in several different ways, but both with the sea and Mackerel, but also in particular with the rain that we heard in Nocturno, and especially the rain on the cafetales, on the coffee plants. Which I think that because Mutis grew up in his early years in Brussels, because his father was a diplomat, I think there was something about a rediscovery of the Colombian earth and the Colombian waterways in particular. For example, in La Nieve del Almirante, in the Snow of the Admiral, Mackerel travels up a fictional river called the Jurando, but there's a very well-known Mutis scholar named Consuelo Hernandez, who's at American University, who has identified which river that is. But I don't think it's a particularly Colombian motif, and that's because Mutis traveled, I think he traveled 30 or 40 weeks a year when he was working in public relations, and so he has written about the Baltic Sea. And he has written about Trieste, he's written about the Mediterranean. I think that he's a writer you have to read with a map in hand. And so the aquatic metaphor comes up not just in Colombia, but all over the place. Although I think the most interesting thing about Mackerel, however, is that all of his adventures happen on land. For all of his, he remembers times being at sea, but if you're going to have adventures, he tends to be more earthbound, and that's what he's looking, I think, to escape, right, to get back on the river. So, yeah, it's a great question, though. I would love to see more written about water in the Mackerel series. So.
Anyone has any more questions? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, it's okay. Thanks, Ryan.
It was interesting to think about Don Quixote at one end and Mutis at the other. Think about Don Quixote often being called the first modern novel,
Right.
and modernity being still wrapped up in the Spanish imperial enterprise.
Right.
So I was wondering, these critiques that both novels projected about their present regarding a desire for an imagined past, like you said, how do their historical contexts at these different ends of modernity, you used the word postmodern novel just a few minutes ago,
Yeah.
How do their historical contexts shape something different about their critiques of their present, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you very much. Ryan is an excellent scholar of Mutis as well. So I would actually love to hear him answer the question too, but I'll go first. So in all of the different critiques and analyses of Mutis that I've seen, there is a divide. Some people really see him as a pre-modern hero, right? The idea, and especially when he says he lives in a time that's ajeno a sus intereses, right, which is separate, alien to him. So some people see him as a pre-modern, old school hero in that sense. I totally disagree, actually. I do think that he is postmodern, especially because if we look at like François Lyotard's idea of being disenchanted with the material and economic gains of modernism, that didn't happen, right, for much of Latin America. And so I think that Mutis shows through Mackerel a deep sense of disenchantment with that thing, with people working like mules, right, for that thing that they call progress. So I see in a very Latin American context a disenchantment with the idea of orden and progreso, as Brazil says, right, the idea that that's just not happening. Now, Mutis is not unique in that sense. I think he's writing in a long tradition of critiquing the failed promises of modernity. With Cervantes, I think that the context is, of course, very different. I think that Cervantes, most people see Cervantes, especially the second half of Don Quixote, as critiquing the bureaucracy and aristocracy in Spain. Spain was deeply in debt to other European countries, and there was a sense that the country was running into the ground. Now, I think that may be an easy reading in hindsight to make, and I don't know if that was really what Cervantes was feeling at the time. But I mean, I think all great authors critique the moments that they live in, right? I have a hard time thinking of any author who doesn't, right? Whose work we still read today. I mean, Voltaire does the same thing for France, and has a similar quest narrative there. So I think that we can paint with a broad brush in saying there's that sense of disenchantment, but I agree that it's good to look at their specific historical consequences and circumstances. So do you want to, do you have an answer for your own question there? What do you think?
I mean, not really. I just remember when I saw Mutis give a talk once, he proclaimed himself to be a monarchist.
Oh, he's famous for doing that, I know.
The worst thing was the end of Byzantium.
Right.
And so, just kind of curious about how he goes back before a period long before Cervantes himself as his own object of desire as an author. But it seems like the novels are very much about ruins of modernity.
Yeah.
Factories and the ships. And it's interesting to think about the idea of the nation in Mutis as well, because there really is never any clear nation that you associate with Mackerel, that you associate with the settings. And Cervantes is clearly writing at the height of imperial Spain, which is an interesting case of the nation. It's also, but I hadn't really thought I hadn't thought about this connection in your talk, so I don't know.
Oh, good. No, that's okay. Well, I do think that so Mutis is famous for proclaiming himself to be a monarchist whenever he's asked about politics. And I think that idea comes from his épater la bourgeoisie idea of, like, that's why he says that marriage is just as, prostitution is just as conventional as marriage, right? He wants to shock people and go against their accepted idea of what's going on. I think he also wants to avoid talking about politics there, especially living in exile in Mexico City. I think he also wants to echo Mackerel, who for him was like another person in his life, when he says that he's living in a time that's alien to his interest. I think that's a crystallization and perhaps exaggeration of that idea. So yeah, I mean, Mackerel himself is certainly against the notion of power dominating him, right? He wants to be autonomous. So, but yeah, it's a good quote. So, thank you.
I just want to say, when you come out with your book on El Dorado for your dust jacket photo, make sure you're holding a cocktail.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom.
Break the academic mold, too.
Yes, I'll be sure. Well, I don't know about that, but thank you very much. I'll be sure to.
Quickly, what was his personal life like?
Well, I mean, I know that he was married and had children. I know that he worked for his entire life in publicity, and so that was one of the reasons why he traveled around so much. And I think that is an important part of his literature. But he's also, unlike a lot of the very famous boom writers who were able to make a living off of their writings, right? Like I said, Mutis didn't retire until he was in his 60s, and that's when he wrote his novels. He had been famous for being a poet before, but he had a 9-to-5 or more, just like a lot of us. So I think that's an inspiring biographical detail, that we should all keep working on our novels and poetry in our off hours.
Well, on that note, join me in thanking Charlotte for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.